even in 2016, when I was, when Trump was first gaining momentum and first debates and all that stuff, and everybody was going crazy, and I definitely was not a Trump supporter at that point, I kept saying, despite the fact that I didn't like how he was talking to Megyn Kelly and all that, I was like, this guy is more real than the rest of these people. If you can name 20 Democrats, Elizabeth Warren, all the way down. Just look at the last crop of Democrats, Pete and Biden and the rest of them. Who's more real? Is it Donald Trump or Joe Biden? Who's more real, Donald Trump or Pete? Who's more real, Donald Trump or Elizabeth Warren? Like, it was just so damn obvious. And when they try to be humans, it's why I like those clips of, with the newscasters, when they have to actually be human for a second and they're like, they can't quite compute.
I love that about Senator Kennedy, too, and he has so many hilarious clips out there of next time you're in trouble, call a crackhead, because it's just the best thing I've ever seen. But it reminds me of these times that the Democrats tried to be real humans. Do you remember that video of Elizabeth Warren walking into her own house and getting a beer out of the fridge and trying to act like she's like casually there? That was so weird.
I'ma get me a beer. Like, you people are just absolutely terrible. Did you see?
You just heard Dave Rubin and Isabel Brown, two pro-Trump influencers, in one episode of People of the Internet, aired on YouTube earlier this year. David Rubin hosted the show on the YouTube channel of Tenet Media, a US-based media company that, according to a US Department of Justice statement released on 4th September this year, received several $1 million from two employees of Russia Today. Russia Today is also known as RT. It's a multi-language state-controlled media pushing Kremlin's propaganda throughout the world. Putin's meddling in US domestic politics and elections is, of course, nothing new and dates back to the 2016 presidential election won by Donald Trump. This is the second episode of Weird, a global take on the US election. You can check the first episode of our podcast on our website at weirdpodcast.com and on our YouTube channel at WeirdPod. My name is Vito Laterza. I'm an anthropologist, political analyst, and associate professor at the University of Agder in Kristiansand, Norway. I'm also a fellow at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study in Uppsala, Sweden, where I'm broadcasting from today.
Hi, and my name is Louis Römer. I'm an anthropologist, media scholar, and lecturer here at Vassar College, New York, where I am broadcasting from today.
What you heard is a pretty run-of-the-mill attack on US Democrats, whose alleged inauthenticity is compared to Donald Trump, who's, according to this right-wing messaging, more real. The rest of the show we sampled here repeats pretty much all the main tropes of what was then Trump's campaign against Biden. The clip is from February 2024, when Biden was still the Democratic nominee before Kamala Harris took over. As Charlie Wartzel noted in his piece, YouTubers are almost too easy to dupe on The Atlantic. In this election interference operation, Kremlin operatives didn't actually have to do much because they just paid already existing media producers for content they were already producing. One influencer allegedly received a monthly fee of $400,000 plus a $100,000 signing bonus to produce 4 weekly videos on Tenet Media. Another one got $100,000 per video. Since launching in November 2023, Tenet posted nearly 2,000 videos with more than 16 million views on YouTube alone. And they also used other social media such as X, Instagram, and TikTok. Some of the big names that Tenet Media recruited included not only Dave Rubin, but also Benny Johnson and Tim Pool. They have millions of followers on the channels and are well known in this kind of pro-Trump social media galaxy. They've denied any wrongdoing and actually claimed to be victims of the Russian scheme. Louis, what's going on here? Why are Putin's people pouring in such large sums of money into American right-wing influencers?
Well, to answer this question, it's helpful to look at this particular incident in a longer perspective. All the way back in 2016, and before that, there was many rumors, discussion about potential Russian influence operations in the US. What has come out of that is particularly propaganda operations that were targeting particularly African American voters in the US in swing states. And here the goal is not so much even to convert people from one, from one candidate to another, but just to sometimes dissuade people from voting, demotivating them, demobilizing them, sowing division, exploiting wedge issues, and so on. So that's really what uh, this is a part of. What we just saw is a part of this broader attempt from Russian propagandists to try to find these particular types of places where they can create division, demobilize, fracture the coalition that they want to oppose.
So what about the style that this kind of Dave Rubin and Isabel Brown used? What can we say about the performance?
I mean, it's very interesting to see this clip now in the aftermath of Tim Walz's reframing, right, of this notion of authenticity around who gets to own authenticity, who gets to own realness. I think one of the reasons why Tim Walz ended up becoming the VP was that, that the coup de grace where he took this framing strategy up from under, pulled it up from under the MAGA world, where they were really banking on framing themselves as the normal, the authentic, the real people. And then the Democrats are weird, right? It's the one of the speakers was like, they're so weird, right? It's almost prefiguring like the way that Tim Walz was going to adopt and flip this frame. But one thing that I do want to emphasize here is how little detail we get about the supposed realness of Trump. Like there isn't really evidence. Uh, um, so really this is a good example of priming, right? So what's happening here is an audience is being told how to perceive something, how to something without too much content, without too much actual concrete evidence, but it's really to pre-shape perception. So you can talking about preemptive framing, basically, which is a tactically where you define someone or something before they get a chance to define themselves.
Yep.
And so in that way, the audience is already trained to understand Democrats as being not normal because they've been told to do so. Even and it's often these preemptive framings are very hard to shake off. So the first one that gets to define gets to control the debate. But it's really interesting how that definition of who's weird and who's normal has been unsettled, right? And over the last couple of months.
Yes, and I think that's what we explored in episode 1 that you can check on our channels. I mean, we went a bit more in depth about Tim Walz, the vice presidential nominee for the Democrats, basically what he actually did to revert all of this, right? Because for a long time, as you said, it's been the Republicans, the right wingers who have this kind of assumption that they are the normal ones, so they know what's true or what's what should be taught by the viewers or the listeners. But now here you have a Democrat, trying to turn that around and saying, actually, it's the Republicans who are the weird people. It's these people just talking, about Trump being real who are weird. And I think today's show will go a bit into this weirdness on that kind of right wing and libertarian side of it. Let's listen to another clip where we explore a bit more who is this Rubin guy and his trajectory.
I'm puzzled by the anger on the left about everything.
There is anger about everything because they believe they're victims. And when you're a victim, you have the righteous indignation to be angry at everything and at everyone. So I get a particular special strain of this anger because I was one of them. And when they see a refugee leave and escape and then get to some level of success, that's the kryptonite for them, right? Because they don't want people to realize, oh, you can get out of this, that you can find what your truth is, you can find another path, you can find success, you can find happiness, whatever it is you're looking for, you can find it. And they don't want that because they want conformity.
Yeah, there was Dave Rubin talking to John Stossel, another right-wing libertarian podcaster, and it's from a YouTube recording that was released in February this year. Rubin is openly gay and has a Jewish background, and he used to have a show on the left-wing network, The Young Turks. So here Rubin is talking about leaving the left, basically. In 2020, he published the book, Don't Burn This Book, Thinking for Yourself in an Age of Unreason, where he narrates this personal journey, right? From leftist commentator to what he calls classical liberal. Mind you, he's now a Trump supporter, so I think the label right-wing libertarian might be a bit more appropriate. But I'm struck by the way he talks about the left. I mean, it almost sounds like he left a cult of some sorts.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And even reflecting on the title of his book, Don't Burn This Book, just a month or so ago, we saw images from Florida where entire libraries of books are being tossed in the garbage as the governor there, DeSantis, is implementing his essentially what are book bans. So really, here again, you see this kind of attempt to define the other side in ways that probably would be quite unrecognizable for people on the left or the center in terms of how they are. Um, and there is also something that strikes me there about finding happiness, right? That a trope here of the pursuit of happiness that really hooks into some pretty primordial American myths, right? About finding success, the pursuit of happiness being part of the language of the founding fathers, right? So that's an interesting thing that gets woven in there, that you have to leave the left, and the left is conformity. And all of that has really been quite effectively rebutted in the past months when we see Democratic politicians claiming this notion of freedom and saying, well, what they want, right? The Republicans, people like Dave Rubin, they want conformity. We want you to be free to express yourself. We want you to be free, et cetera, right? So they've taken up that same set of tropes, but have deployed them in very different ways that Rubin is here.
And I think the point you're making also shows that, I mean, sadly, perhaps this is a lot of performance, right? It's a rhetorical game. So in the end, the words don't always mean what they're supposed to mean, but it's what you were saying before. It's more about convincing, persuading the audience that you are the real thing, that you are the ones who holds the truth and, you know, the right answers to your problems, and therefore the others are the enemies, you know, the people you have to discard, insult even, or get rid of, because they are on your way to happiness. I think another point that emerges here quite clearly, I think, from what you're saying, but also from Rubin's case, we're really going beyond this kind of left and right categories, right? So here there is somebody who says, I'm moving from the left, but then I'm still a libertarian. That, you know, there's all this idea of diagonalism that we already explored in episode 1. You can go back to that. There's this very good piece by Callison and Slobodian in the Boston Review. Basically, diagonalism is this emerging field of populist politics where traditional distinctions between left and right are abandoned. So there is a strong focus on individual freedoms. We see that in Rubin, but as you said, also now in the counter movement by the Democrats. But again, these movements in the end still tend to lean towards the right. So even though Rubin claims all the time that, you know, the left, they are the authoritarians, they are the bad guys, so to speak, in the end, he can't really get out of this kind of right wing, this trajectory towards the right, even as he calls himself a classic liberal. I wanted to play another clip by Rubin in the same interview, which shows this move and this reflection on the left and right quite clearly.
I would say that generally speaking, the left-right paradigm, or the left-right dichotomy, whatever you want to call that, it doesn't really fly anymore. I think you basically have libertarians, and I mean that in terms of people who basically want to live and let live, and then you have authoritarians and people who want the government to control things. I don't know where that really falls left, right anymore. Since I started down this political evolution, where I've now connected with people like you and conservatives like a Ben Shapiro or a Dennis Prager or Larry Elder or just any of these people, some of the Fox guys like Gutfeld or Tucker, everybody, for all the differences that we might have, I'm pro-choice, most of them are pro-life, I'm against the death penalty, most of them are for the death penalty. They're all willing to sit down and discuss ideas. And we all, I think, agree on one thing more than anything else, which is within the framework of free speech, which is that we want to live in the same country. I want to live in the same country with people who disagree with me. And the problem that the left is having right now is if you deviate from whatever the given moment of feelings are, they will expunge you.
I mean, here we hear a lot of this kind of libertarian talk, right? So he's saying the real difference is not left and right, but libertarian versus authoritarians. Perhaps we need to, tell our audience a bit more about this libertarianism, right? Because it's kind of quite distinctive of the American tradition. Of course, it's having a lot of influence also in Europe and other countries, but there's something quite distinctively American about that.
Yeah. The thing that always strikes me as so ironic about US libertarian rhetoric is something that I think I could best summarize by an image I saw once while I was driving from my office on the way to my home. There was a flag that says "Don't tread on me," right, which is often used in right libertarian context. It's this kind of anti-authoritarian, image that harkens back to the American Revolutionary era, alongside "Back the Blue," which is a slogan that was used against the Black Lives Matter protest, very much in favor of, in support of the police, which is the avatar, the incarnation of state authority, right? So there's this interesting paradox of, on the one hand, yes, freedom, but on the other hand, authority. And what it ends up being often is freedom for me, authority for you, right? I'm liberated to constrain you. And so what ends up happening in terms of how the left is being defined, the left here is being defined as authoritarian and dangerous. It then becomes the alibi for actually arguing for repressive measures against the so-called authoritarian left, which paradoxically then ends up the people who say they are for freedom arguing for authoritarian measures, right? So it's they're for free speech. The other team are people who want to cancel you. They want to expunge everyone. So we need to expunge them in order to save free speech, right? So that's the propaganda move that happens. And one way to think about this is as a mirror politics, mirror argumentation, right? So you accuse the other side of that which you might want to do, right? And sometimes it's not even an intentional move. It is something that is created through the course of these moral panics around freedom and constraint that can lead people to actually advocate for extreme measures in order to preserve the so-called freedom, which paradoxically break the freedom, right? Because you have to repress to preserve.
Well, I mean, you talk about Black Lives Matter, so you're also hinting there at some kind of racial politics, which, of course, in the US and the Western world, it's always been historical and it's coming to the fore in a very strong way in these recent years of right-wing populism. Do you think there's some kind of alliance there around race that is bringing these libertarians with the far right and really aligned in the end, around the arguments you mentioned?
Yeah, I think effectively, and I know there are libertarians who see this and recognize this as a problem among libertarians, but quite effectively, certain groups of people, with migrants, queer people, transgender people, and of course, Black people who are specifically um, in these racial justice movements, such as Black Lives Matter, have been quite effectively framed, quite effectively defined as being threats to freedom. And thus, this then becomes an easy way to rope libertarians into a right wing, a far right coalition, because then they end up endorsing, paradoxically, on limiting the freedom of the people who they see as a threat to freedom.
And I think that's where perhaps the alignment with Putin also becomes quite clear, right? Because, we're talking about one half of the big Russian interference operation that has been uncovered recently by the FBI and the Department of Justice. So in this half, this Tenet Media kind of operation, it doesn't look like the Russia Today operatives had to do much, right? The propaganda was already there. These people are quite aligned. We know that Trump and Vance, even on foreign politics, they're pretty aligned with Putin. They said that they will pretty much side with Putin in terms of ending the Ukraine-Russian war in their own way. We discussed a bit that also in episode 1, if our listeners want to go back to that. So what's the alignment there with Putin, if you had to, put it in a few words?
Yeah, I think it's a mistake to assume or to approach the notion of Russian interference as Russia trying to inject some foreign ideology into the bloodstream, if you will, to use a metaphor there, of US political discourse. But really, what is happening is something a lot more strategic in the sense of a convergence, and really Russia just exploiting divisions and trends that already exist and already are rooted in US political discourse. They're not necessarily trying to inject new ideas more than that they're trying to materially often support the tendencies that converge with their own agenda. And in this case, what they really are interested in is a sense of a realignment of the US vis-a-vis their policies in Eastern Europe, right? They definitely want less NATO presence there. They want to be able to expand their zone of influence back to where it was during the era of the Cold War. And one way to do that is to strengthen the elements in US society that want also a smaller a footprint of US influence in that sphere.
Well, on that note, let's listen to US Attorney General Merrick Garland a few days ago in a press conference on 4th of September when he talks about the other part of this Russian operation.
The online infrastructure used by the Russian public relations company, known as the Social Design Agency, or SDA, and related actors included what are sometimes referred to as cyber-squatted domains. These websites were designed to appear to American readers as if they were major US news sites like the Washington Post or Fox News. But in fact, they were fake sites. They were filled with Russian government propaganda that had been created by the Kremlin to reduce international support for Ukraine, bolster pro-Russian policies and interests, and influence voters in the United States and in other countries. Internal documents of the Kremlin describe the content as, quote, bogus stories disguised as newsworthy events, close quote. This malign influence campaign has been referred to as Doppelganger. The Russian public relations company drove viewers to these websites by deploying influencers and paid social media advertisements. They also created fake social media profiles, posing as US citizens, post comments on social media platforms with links to the sites. According to SDA's records, it actively sought to, quote, eliminate the possibility of detection of the Russian footprint.
Yeah, that was Merrick Garland basically describing in quite clear and synthetic terms what this Doppelganger operation was and still is, because actually this operation covers many more countries than just the US. There's been France, Germany, Italy, and many other countries hit, usually countries that support Ukraine, especially in the West. It's been going on, at least according to various disinformation experts, at least since basically 2022 when the war erupted. But I think what I found quite interesting is really this idea, again, pushing the boundaries between fake and true, right? And using a very simple technique, the cyber squatting, as they call it, it's actually a pretty old technique. So what you do, for instance, when you type your Gmail too quickly, you make a typo, back in the days, some kind of scammer of, very aggressive advertising, sometimes even porn website would have these other domains just to redirect traffic there. So basically that's what they're doing. They made it so realistic that if you were on this kind of fake domain, for instance, the Washington Post, instead of being .com, it was .pm. Basically, in some of these sites, you would link and go back to the real domain. So that's how basically mixed up it was. And I think the other interesting thing was really the mixing of fake and real. So it's quite clear from the documents we now got from the FBI, because they had documents directly from the companies operating pretty much under Putin's aegis. We don't know the level of coordination, but we know that basically they are linked to the Russian state. They basically made it clear that the fake news had to kind of be hidden within a lot of pretty plausible, realistic, and real news.
Right, because the embedding it within plausible and real information helps to lower the guard of scrutiny. I mean, other tactics have um, relied on social media accounts or Facebook pages, right? That would enable sharing. And one of the things about sharing is that if you're sharing something um, from somebody you know, if somebody reads that post and it's been shared by a friend, you're more likely to trust it, even if you don't necessarily know the source from where the person you know got that post from. So setting up Facebook pages with sock puppet accounts and so on. There are many doppelgangers currently all still on social media. Every person who gets any kind of uh, following will often have to swat down multiple attempts of impersonation, many doppelgangers, because this is an active tactic, which not only Russia uses, it has to be said, other entities are as well.
Yeah, perhaps I think going back to the point before, because sometimes this mention of Russia tends to create also this kind of, progressive sensationalism, if you want, or
Mm,
anti-Trump sensationalism. I mean, as you said before, a lot of these things are really homegrown. So we're seeing much more of an organic alliance between sectors of the far right and these libertarian thinkers and propagandists and Putin, rather than some kind of very subordinate relationship where Putin or his Russian operatives would call all the shots. A lot of this stuff have become pretty much staple of propaganda tactics. They've been staples of propaganda tactics from Western and other entities for very long time. So Putin and his team are just very good at it. So we can definitely say that.
mhm.
But it doesn't mean that somehow they invented this, or they are the only people in town using this kind of tactics. I mean, I think one thing that was quite interesting to read in the really interesting affidavit that was released by the Department of Justice from this kind of FBI agents who worked on this. This was a document obtained from the Social Design Agency, one of these Kremlin-controlled companies that operated, that basically ran this operation. And this part basically reads: in order for this work to be effective, you need to use a minimum of fake news and a maximum of realistic information. At the same time, you should continuously repeat that this is what is really happening, but the official media will never tell you about it or show it to you. So once
Mm,
again, this anti-establishment, right? So we are
yes.
the ones telling you the truth, and there's a conspiracy,
Mm.
hiding it from you.
I mean, there's a pithy phrase that I use to think about this, which is the notion of the Galileo gambit, right? Which is to persuade people that some nameless amorphous cabal is trying to silence you. And therefore, like Galileo being persecuted, you have the truth, right? Now, maybe people are trying to silence you, or maybe people are just laughing at you because you're talking nonsense. However, if you can successfully persuade people that you are this, speaker of truth, brave truth teller, brave speaker of truth to power, maverick, going against the establishment, what have you, you can then often persuade people of what you're trying to say, even though it's not on the basis of the content of what you're arguing for, but the basis of this speaker of truth to power persona that you've constructed, right? Um, it is very common, right, to see this sort of claim, like I'm being silenced, and being made over and over again. And but when you scrutinize that claim, you notice that these people have significant platforms and outreach. So yes, right. So then, in terms of the facticity of that claim, it falls apart. But what really is, it's a tactic to allow people to start to empathize with people as victims. So it's very interesting more mode of mirror propaganda there, because while you're accusing the left of constantly being victims, the main propaganda strategy that you are using to gain persuasive appeal is to frame yourself as a victim who is being oppressed by the oppressive left, right? So the mainstream is lying to you, they've betrayed you, they're oppressing you like they're oppressing me. I'm the person who has the real truth, and they don't want you to know. Here's the truth that they don't want you to know, right? That's usually the cliche here. Like, here's the truth that they don't want you to know. And therefore, and it's true because they don't want you to know, whoever they is.
Yes, and I think this really leads us back to one of the main characters of the current U.S. melodrama, J.D. Vance, right? Who of course shows many parallels. He's the vice presidential nominee for the Republicans. We have touched on him a little bit in episode 1, mostly to show the quite aggressive xenophobic propaganda he's pushing. But I think we want to dig a bit deeper in this episode into his persona and also his trajectory, because a bit like Rubin, kind of changed over the years. It wasn't always like this, right? So he writes this book, Hillbilly Elegy, published in 2016 in the middle of the Trump campaign. Again, it's also about victims. In this case, the victims are the Appalachian, this very mythical people now. Appalachia is this rural region of the eastern part of the U.S. that covers many states, including many of the battleground states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. We all know it because at some point he was producing most of the coal, of the U.S. as a country. So a lot of this idea of the white working class, very much this idea of the rural whites. So what's happening in Hillbilly Elegy? Who are the victims there, and how did Vance start his political career, really? Because that book in 2016 was really his launch on the political scene.
Yeah, and it's interesting that in November 2016, a few people who had reviewed the book already observed that the memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, had the structure and the rhetoric that one would expect for a future politician that is intending to run for office. Compare Hillbilly Elegy, for example, with The Audacity of Hope, the memoir that Barack Obama used to launch his career as a nationwide politician. And it's almost, the titles already show that there is a kind of intertextual, a kind of response. Yeah. Audacity of Hope, Hillbilly Elegy. There is an interesting response there, call and response there. And of course, this book has become well reviewed, discussed. First, it was praised among the establishment liberal media, New York Times, Think New Yorker, etc. It even got made into a movie with Glenn Close and Amy Adams, so some high-profile stars, and the narrative is quite interesting that it is being promoted here, because the primary victim in the memoir, in many ways, is Vance himself, who is the victim in the most direct manner of his mother's abuse, and but then this gets extrapolated into a broader narrative of the abandonment of the so-called white working class in Appalachia and the Rust Belt. So already from the outset, there were people from Appalachia who questioned not only his own authenticity to speak on behalf of Appalachia, because he grows up in suburban Ohio, not in rural Appalachia, but yet he was being presented in the liberal media as some kind of whisperer of Kentucky and West Virginia coal country, which is really someplace where his ancestors are from, his grandparents, great grandparents, but not really where he himself is from, right? So there was a lot of challenge around that. But then the other part, which is the narrative of victimization of the white working class that Hillbilly Elegy produces, focuses very much on the idea that the working class was betrayed by, coastal elites, liberals, etc., who have disdain for them. But then he adds the notion that it is the schemes to improve the economic livelihoods of the working class that have harmed him somehow. So in a very clever way, within this victim narrative is packaged a narrative about cultures of poverty, and he's basically blaming the white working class for its own misfortune and suffering, saying, well, and he's speaking as being a member of this community, we have self-destructive cultural tendencies. His mother is the main example of this that he uses in his book to argue this, and therefore the schemes to improve the livelihoods of white working class people won't work and are harmful and are part of the betrayal, right? All right. So who's the victim and who's to blame, right, is a big major reason why this book ended up being later, after being celebrated initially, ended up being really strongly criticized, especially by other people from Appalachia.
Yeah, so let's listen to a clip from an interview, again, one of these mainstream liberal media interviews that J.D. Vance had. It was with Charlie Rose. He kind of fell a bit into disgrace after some kind of sexual harassment scandal after. But Charlie Rose was pretty much at the top of his game then, very mainstream, did also 60 Minutes at some point. So let's listen to this clip with a quite different Vance from the Vance we know today.
Yeah, so I think there is a precious little dialogue between these two big cultural segments of America. So sort of middle America, flyover country, whatever you want to call it. Donald Trump has become their sort of representative, and they're very proud, even though they may not like
trouble
him.
in Pennsylvania.
Exactly.
In the Camry in 2008.
Sure, for saying that folks cling to their guns and religion, right? Yes. Which I think it was a well-intentioned comment, right? He mentioned that folks were struggling economically, and that was his explanation. But it was sort of layered with a certain amount of condescension. You don't, adults that you respect don't cling to things. You might have said it a much different way, and I don't think the comment would have had nearly the effect that it did if he'd said it in a much more compassionate way.
So how do we change this?
Yeah, so that's a really tough question. I mean, I continue to think that one of the big problems, one of the big sources of this cultural divide is the fact that people aren't spending a whole lot of time together. So, when my wife, who is of Indian descent, was born in San Diego, the first time that I brought her home, I was terrified that she would think my family was a bunch of dumb hillbillies and that my family think that she was this sort of out-of-touch elitist. And the truth is that they actually love each other, and that's obviously a small example But, when people spend time to each other, there's contact theory that suggests that when people from different groups spend time with each other, they actually empathize with each other in a much greater extent. It's a consequence of the fact that we have too much geographic segregation between the elites and the rest of the country. At the end of the day, if you're a policymaker in Washington, D.C., you know very little about the people in Middletown, Ohio, not because you're a bad person, but because you don't actually spend much time with them.
That was J.D. Vance in October 2016. So that was only a few months after he had released his book, Hillbilly Elegy. Let's listen to him now in a podcast that he had with Eric Weinstein on Weinstein's podcast, The Portal, when they were basically talking about childcare and free market economics. Let's listen to this clip.
You can sort of see the effect it has on him to be around them. Like, they spoil him. There's sort of all the classic stuff that grandparents do to grandchildren, but it makes him a much better human being to have exposure to his grandparents.
Well, I don't know.
And the evidence on this, by the way, is like super clear.
That's the whole purpose of the postmenopausal
Yes.
female in theory. Did your in-laws, and particularly your mother-in-law, show up in some huge way?
She lived with us for a year.
Right.
So,
So I didn't know the answer to that.
Right. No,
because that's this weird unadvertised feature of marrying an Indian woman.
No, it's in some ways the most transgressive thing I've ever done against sort of the hyper neoliberal approach to work and family.
So we just listened now to a quite different Vance. There was the one talking about Obama. Okay, one can take issue with his position there, but still in a very intercultural way, showing some kind of sensitivity, even talking about group contact theory, how people empathize more, if they spend more time together. And then we get this pretty shady clip, with another tech bro. I mean, both of them, both Eric Weinstein and J.D. Vance, have in common Peter Thiel as a patron. We'll talk more about this right-wing libertarian, tech billionaire, the founder of PayPal. We will have other shows to talk about that. But the content is very crude, right? And it looks like, okay, he's trying to use neoliberalism, so some hint of leftism there again, of a critique of capitalism, but really just to affirm pretty crude statements about gender roles and also racialized gender roles. Somehow the role of Indian women is to take care of children, or and similar kind of discourse. So, and now you fast forward, even now what we're hearing in the speeches, very rabid anti-immigrant propaganda. So what's going on, Louis? So how can somebody change so much just within a few years?
I mean, it's an open question whether or not he actually changed, or maybe it is the discourse around him that has changed. But I'll say this. One thing that really stands out is a shift of emphasis from a politics of recognition, right? That the coastal elites need to recognize and see middle America's sensitivities and vice versa, right? So he's really centering his argument there around the politics of empathy and recognition, which very much explains why he was able to appeal to centrist and liberal commentators, because what he's offering as a solution for the problems in the US is nothing too radical. It's just, let's all get together and empathize and see each other, be seen and be heard, and so on. What's interesting in comparison to 2020 is how much that framework has been completely tossed aside in favor of a quite brutish disregard for sensitivities of women. And the bigger question here is, are these things actually in contradiction? Perhaps the project was never for him, never a politics of recognition and empathy that would be universal, but rather to argue that certain segments of the US population deserve more empathy and sympathy than others. So maybe, in fact, that's really what's changing in terms of his rhetoric, is the emphasis on recognizing and empathizing with so-called middle America, which he then ostensibly claims to represent. And now the emphasis is shifting towards disregarding, and marginalizing those that are ostensibly undeserving of sympathies, such as immigrants and women or immigrant women.
Yes, I mean, I think it's still important to make the point about this kind of politics of respectability. I know it's been attacked left and right, sadly. But while I wouldn't agree with Vance in 2016, I would have much preferred to have Vance in 2016 as a respectable, political commentator than Vance now in 2024. I'm making the point about the damages that then this awful vitriolic rhetoric does. So, as you said, I think you're right to say that the basis of the rhetoric is already there, but I think it makes a lot of difference if you make some kind of slightly problematic statement about Obama and intercultural, kind of understanding to the kind of stuff we're hearing, now in the Trump and Vance campaign. But to wrap up this part on Vance, let's see also how this mix of left and right really comes in this very masculine way, I would say, in a recent speech he had just a few days ago at the International Association of Firefighters conference in Boston.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Well, Semper Fi, guys. It sounds like we got some fans and some haters. That's okay. Listen to what I have to say here, and I'll make my pitch. President Trump and I are proud to be the most pro-worker Republican ticket in history, and I want to talk about why we're fighting for working people, why we're going to fight for unions and non-union alike. After supporting Democrats for so long in this union, what has it gotten you? Over the past 70 years, union membership in this country, and this is not a good thing, but it has declined. The influence of unions has declined, and the wages of working people, union and non-union alike, have not kept up with the pace of inflation over the last 3.5 years. So I want to ask you a question that Donald Trump asked America in 2016, what the hell do you have to lose? You all are the embodiment of American spirit, heroic, determined, selfless, hardworking, and tough. This country was built by people like you. America is great because of people like you, and I believe you deserve a government that is loyal to you.
I would say not exactly a success. I mean, you don't really call your target audience haters, but still we can hear this kind of, again, left-right mixes where this macho nationalism is kind of masked as a kind of advocate of the working class. But I would say the nationalism and the very masculine form of these tough people who built America seems to really overtake any kind of sensible discussion about progressivism or being pro-worker and any related issues as such. Today we spent quite a lot of time on this right-wing Republican side of the campaign, but let's see what's up on the Democrat side. One piece of news is that Harris and Walz have finally given an interview to the media. They spoke with CNN's Dana Bash at the end of August. Let's listen to a clip where Kamala Harris talks to Bash on CNN.
That we have inflation at under 3%. A lot of our policies have led to the reality that America recovered faster than any wealthy nation around the world. But you are right. Prices, in particular for groceries, are still too high. The American people know it, I know it, which is why my agenda includes what we need to do to bring down the price of groceries. For example, dealing with an issue like price gouging. What we need to do to extend the child tax credit to help young families be able to take care of their children in their most formative years. What we need to do to bring down the cost of housing. My proposal includes what would be a tax credit of $25,000 for first-time home buyers, so they can just have enough to put a down payment on a home, which is part of the American dream and their aspiration, but do it in a way that allows them to actually get on the path to achieving that goal and that dream.
So you have been vice president for 3.5 years.
Yeah.
The steps that you're talking about now, Why haven't you done them already?
Well, first of all, we had to recover as an economy, and we have done that. I'm very proud of the work that we have done that has brought inflation down to less than 3%. The work that we have done to cap the cost of insulin at $35 a month for seniors. Donald Trump said he was going to do a number of things, including allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices. Never happened. We did it.
I chose this clip because I wanted to show that Kamala Harris actually did quite well, in my opinion. But we're hearing quite a lot also from the Democrat side that perhaps she's not doing so well in unscripted environments. There's been some kind of strategy, perhaps by some of her advisors, not to expose her too much to the press. What do you think?
Well, it seems to me that this strategy of trying to shield her from press encounters might be overcautious, because as we saw, she seems to be doing pretty well with improvisational answers, with thinking on her feet on the clip we just saw. And there's always risk that if one isn't out defining the issues, then and defining oneself as the candidate, then that leaves the room for the other to define to be defined by the other, right? So if you're not defining the issues, then the other people are defining it for you, and that's not strategically the best position to be in. Then on the other hand, we can also see a contrast between what Kamala Harris is doing in terms of defining the economic issues that she's running her campaign on, and how strongly they contrast with J.D. Vance's presentation, which with Kamala Harris, who stresses on defining the problem in terms of redistribution of resources, getting prices down, going after price gougers. She's drawing on her experience and her personality, her public persona as a prosecutor here, to link up that history with what she's going to do in the future, right? That lends credibility to this idea that she's going after price gouging, and also defining the problem as certain economic elites were keeping prices artificially high. In contrast with Vance, what we see is a talk about redistribution of affects, of emotions, right? We'll be loyal to you. We're redistributing loyalty instead of money. And then also emphasizing this notion of not a working class defined in economic terms, but this notion of hardworking Americans, tough, right? Tough and hale and hearty. So a constituency being defined in cultural terms, really, right, as having these kind of traditionally masculine qualities, right? Hardworking, serious, who built America. And what we're getting here is about loyalty to America, loyalty from Vance and Trump to them, and not so much in terms of redistribution. At least no concrete things being offered in terms of redistribution of actual job opportunities or taking prices down and so on. It's more like that the economic narrative is subsumed by Vance under a cultural narrative of betrayal, of affect, emotions.
Yes, and I think we go back to some of the points we made earlier in the show. There's not much definition of what this social and economic program would be from the side of Vance and Trump, while we have pretty clear measures, from Harris and Walz. We covered quite a lot today. Please make sure to subscribe to our channels, whether you get our show in the main podcast platforms such as Spotify or on YouTube, X, and Facebook. We will be back in a few days with the next episode with more vibes and drama from the US election. You can get in touch with us by email at info@weirdpodcast.com. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter at weirdpodcast.com so that you will get our next episodes straight in your inbox. Until next time.